In the winter of 1939, a desperate woman named Eleanor Hartwell burst through the doors of Edgar Cayce's modest reading room in Virginia Beach, clutching a small antique mirror that seemed to radiate an inexplicable coldness. For 6 weeks, she had been unable to sleep, plagued by the sensation that someone was watching her from within the ornate silver frame. Every time she looked into the mirror, she saw not just her own reflection, but the faint outline of an elderly man standing behind her, his mouth moving as if trying to speak words she couldn't hear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor wasn't a believer in the supernatural. She was a practical schoolteacher from Richmond, who had inherited the mirror from her recently deceased Uncle Theodore. But what started as simple grief had transformed into something far more disturbing. When objects in her home began moving on their own, temperatures would drop suddenly in rooms where the mirror was present, and neighbors started complaining about hearing muffled voices coming from her house at all hours of the night. When Edgar Cayce entered his trance state for reading 28471, what he revealed about Eleanor's mirror would fundamentally change how thousands of people understood the relationship between physical objects and spiritual entities. But more shocking than his explanation of the mirror was his warning about 4 other specific types of objects that could trap human souls after death, preventing them from moving on to their next spiritual destination. What Cayce discovered about these soul-trapping objects wasn't just theory. Over the following decades, he would document case after case of people tormented by deceased relatives and strangers whose spirits had become anchored to physical items, unable to complete their transition to the afterlife. The implications of these findings were so profound that they challenged everything mainstream spirituality believed about death and the continuation of consciousness. Edgar Cayce had been giving psychic readings for over 2 decades by the time Eleanor Hartwell walked into his life, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover about her uncle's mirror. As Cayce settled into his familiar trance state, his stenographer, Gladys Davis, positioned herself to capture every word of what would become one of the most disturbing readings in the entire Edgar Cayce archive. Reading 2847-1 began normally enough, with Cayce's consciousness expanding to access what he called the Akashic records. But within minutes, his voice took on an urgency that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. According to the transcript, Cayce began describing Theodore Hartwell, Eleanor's uncle, not as a soul who had successfully transitioned after death, but as a consciousness trapped within the molecular structure of the silver mirror he had cherished during his final years. Theodore had been a wealthy antiquities dealer who spent his last 15 years obsessively polishing and admiring himself in the ornate Victorian mirror. In his final months, battling a terminal illness, Theodore had become convinced that his reflection held the key to his immortality. He would spend hours each day staring into the mirror, repeating affirmations about preserving his essence and refusing to accept his approaching death. What Cayce revealed next sent chills through everyone present. Theodore's intense emotional attachment to the mirror, combined with his desperate fear of death, had created what Cayce termed a, quote, psychic anchor. Instead of releasing his consciousness to move forward in the spiritual realm, Theodore's soul had become electromagnetically bonded to the silver backing of the mirror. Every time someone looked into it, they were not just seeing their own reflection, but were also making contact with Theodore's trapped consciousness. But the case became even more extraordinary when Cayce began describing specific details about Theodore's trapped existence. According to the reading, Theodore retained full awareness of his situation. He could see and hear everything happening in the rooms where the mirror was placed, but he could only communicate through subtle manipulations of the physical environment. The moving objects, the temperature changes, and the mysterious voices were all Theodore's desperate attempts to get Eleanor's attention and ask for help in releasing him from his predicament. Cayce explained that Theodore's situation was far from unique. Throughout history, countless souls had become trapped in physical objects due to intense emotional attachments formed during their final years of life. These attachments created energetic bonds so strong that they prevented the natural process of spiritual transition that should occur after physical death. The solution Cayce provided for Eleanor was both simple and profound. He instructed her to speak directly to the mirror, acknowledging Theodore's presence and giving him permission to release his attachment to the physical realm. She was to explain that his body had died, that his loved ones who had passed before him were waiting for him in the spiritual realm, and that holding onto the mirror was preventing him from reuniting with them. Eleanor followed Cayce's guidance exactly. Standing before the mirror in her living room, she spoke aloud to her uncle, telling him that she understood he was trapped, and that she was giving him permission to let go. She described the peace and joy that awaited him in the afterlife and assured him that she would treasure his memory without needing him to remain attached to physical objects. The results were immediate and dramatic. Eleanor later reported that, as she spoke, the temperature in the room rose perceptibly, and she felt a gentle breeze move through the space despite all windows being closed. The reflection of the elderly man behind her became clearer for just a moment, and she could swear she saw him smile and nod before fading away completely. From that day forward, the mirror returned to showing only normal reflections. The mysterious voices ceased, and Eleanor was able to sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. But Eleanor's case was just the beginning of what Cayce would discover about soul-trapping objects. Over the following years, 4 more categories of items would be identified, each with its own specific mechanism for preventing souls from completing their spiritual transition. What made these discoveries so significant was not just their implications for understanding life after death, but the practical guidance they provided for helping trapped souls find peace and release. The second type of soul-trapping object that Cayce identified emerged from a case in 1941 involving a family in Charleston, South Carolina. The Whitmore family had inherited an antique rocking chair from their grandmother Sarah, who had spent her final 2 years confined to the chair due to severe arthritis. Within days of bringing the chair into their home, family members began experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of sadness whenever they entered the room where the chair was placed. Children refused to play in that room, claiming that the chair was too sad and that they could hear someone crying. Adults reported feeling emotionally drained after spending time near the chair, and several family members complained of developing unexplained joint pain similar to arthritis, despite being young and healthy. When Edgar Cayce was consulted through reading 3156-2, he revealed that Sarah Whitmore's consciousness had become trapped within the wooden frame of the rocking chair. Unlike Theodore's case, where vanity and fear had created the attachment, Sarah's entrapment had resulted from her intense grief and regret about unfinished business with her family. According to Cayce's reading, Sarah had spent her final years in the rocking chair feeling guilty about harsh words she had spoken to various family members and opportunities she had missed to express her love. This emotional turmoil had created what Cayce called a regret spiral that anchored her consciousness to the chair after her physical death. She was trying to communicate her apologies and love through the chair, but her trapped emotional state was only transmitting the sadness and pain she felt about her unresolved issues. The Whitmore family, guided by Cayce's recommendations, held a formal forgiveness ceremony around the rocking chair. Each family member who had experienced conflict with Sarah spoke aloud, expressing their forgiveness for any harsh words and sharing their favorite loving memories of her. They assured her spirit that all family conflicts had been resolved and that they remembered her with pure love and gratitude. During the ceremony, several family members reported feeling a warm presence surrounding them, and one daughter claimed she could smell Sarah's distinctive lavender perfume filling the room. By the end of the ceremony, the oppressive sadness that had pervaded the room was completely gone, replaced by a sense of peace and comfort. The rocking chair returned to being a normal piece of furniture, and the family was able to use it without any negative effects. These 2 cases established a pattern that Cayce would observe repeatedly. Souls became trapped in objects not through random chance, but through intense emotional states during their final period of life. The specific emotion and the nature of their attachment determined both how the trapped soul would manifest and what type of intervention would be needed to help them find release. The third category of soul-trapping objects that Cayce documented involved personal jewelry, particularly items worn consistently during times of intense emotional significance. This discovery came through his work with a young widow named Catherine Morrison from Savannah, Georgia, who sought his help in 1942 regarding her deceased husband's wedding ring. Catherine's husband James had died suddenly in a workplace accident, leaving behind the gold wedding band he had worn for 23 years of marriage. Catherine had been wearing the ring on a chain around her neck since his funeral, but within weeks, she began experiencing phenomena that frightened her. She would wake up feeling as though someone was lying beside her in bed, would smell James's distinctive cologne at random times throughout the day, and would sometimes hear his voice calling her name when she was alone in the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Initially, Catherine had found these experiences comforting, interpreting them as signs that James was still with her. But as weeks turned into months, the manifestations became more intense and disturbing. She began feeling emotionally drained, as if her energy was being slowly sapped away. Friends and family noticed that she seemed to be losing weight and vitality, and some expressed concern that she was becoming obsessed with communicating with her deceased husband. Edgar Cayce's reading 4273-1 revealed a complex situation. James's consciousness had indeed become attached to his wedding ring, but not through his own choice or emotional state. Instead, Catherine's intense grief and desperate desire to maintain connection with her husband had created an energetic pull that prevented James from moving forward in his spiritual journey. Her daily focus on the ring, combined with her refusal to accept that their physical relationship had ended, had inadvertently trapped his soul in a liminal state between life and death. What made this case particularly significant was Cayce's explanation of how the living could unintentionally trap the dead through excessive grief and attachment. He explained that while it was natural and healthy to grieve the loss of loved ones, prolonged intense focus on maintaining connection through physical objects could create energetic bonds that interfered with the deceased person's spiritual progression. In James's case, his love for Catherine was so strong that when he sensed her desperate need for his presence, he had attempted to maintain connection through the wedding ring rather than completing his transition to the afterlife. However, this choice was causing suffering for both of them. James was experiencing confusion and distress in his trapped state, while Catherine was being drained of life energy as her consciousness remained focused on the past rather than moving forward with her own spiritual development. The solution Cayce provided required Catherine to make one of the most difficult decisions a grieving person could face. She needed to lovingly release James from any obligation to remain connected to her through the ring. This didn't mean forgetting him or stopping her love for him, but rather recognizing that true love sometimes requires letting go so that both parties can grow and evolve. Cayce instructed Catherine to perform a release ceremony where she would speak directly to James through the ring, expressing her complete love for him while giving him permission to move forward in his spiritual journey. She was to assure him that she would be fine without his constant presence and that she looked forward to reuniting with him in the spirit realm when her own earthly journey was complete. The ceremony was emotionally challenging for Catherine, but she followed Cayce's guidance precisely. As she spoke her words of release while holding the wedding ring, she reported feeling a profound sense of peace wash over her, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The mysterious manifestations that had been occurring in her home gradually diminished over the following days, and Catherine began to feel more energetic and emotionally balanced than she had since James's death. Interestingly, Catherine continued to occasionally sense James's presence, but these experiences felt different. Instead of the desperate, clinging energy she had felt before, these new contacts felt like brief, loving visits from a soul at peace. Cayce later explained that once James had been released from the energetic trap, he was able to complete his spiritual transition while still maintaining the ability to offer occasional guidance and comfort to his wife from his new state of consciousness. The fourth type of soul-trapping object that Cayce identified was perhaps the most unsettling: children's toys and comfort items. This discovery emerged from a heartbreaking case in 1944 involving the Peterson family from Norfolk, Virginia, who had lost their 7-year-old daughter Emma to scarlet fever. Emma had been exceptionally attached to a handmade cloth doll named Rosie that her grandmother had sewn for her 3rd birthday. The doll went everywhere with Emma, and during her final illness, she had refused to let anyone take it away from her bedside. When Emma died, her parents had buried the doll with her, but her grandmother had secretly removed it from the casket before the funeral, unable to bear the thought of it being placed in the ground. The grandmother, Martha Peterson, kept the doll in Emma's former bedroom, which the family had left exactly as it was on the day Emma died. Within weeks, the household began experiencing phenomena that initially brought comfort but gradually became disturbing. Family members would hear the sound of a child playing in Emma's room, would find toys that had been put away scattered across the floor, and would sometimes glimpse a small figure moving through hallways in their peripheral vision. Martha interpreted these signs as evidence that Emma's spirit was still present and happy, playing with her beloved doll. She began spending hours in Emma's room, talking to the doll as if Emma could hear her, and arranging tea parties with the doll as the guest of honor. Other family members grew increasingly concerned, as Martha's behavior became more obsessive, and her health began to decline. When Edgar Cayce was consulted through reading 53841, he revealed a tragic situation that was even more complex than the previous cases. Emma's soul had indeed become trapped, but not solely through her own attachment to the doll. The combination of Emma's innocent love for her toy, her confusion and fear about death, and her grandmother's intense grief and refusal to let go, had created a perfect storm for spiritual entrapment. According to Cayce's reading, Emma's consciousness remained in a childlike state, unaware that she had died and confused about why her family seemed sad all the time. She was attempting to continue playing and seeking comfort from adults, but her trapped condition prevented her from accessing the spiritual guidance that would normally help a soul transition peacefully after death. What made this case particularly heartbreaking was Cayce's explanation that children's souls were especially vulnerable to becoming trapped because they often lacked the mature understanding needed to navigate the death process independently. In Emma's case, her innocent attachment to the doll, combined with the fear and confusion of her illness, had created an anchor that kept her consciousness focused on familiar physical objects rather than moving toward the light and guidance available in the spiritual realm. The solution Cayce provided required the entire Peterson family to work together in helping Emma understand what had happened and giving her permission to move forward. He instructed them to gather in Emma's room and speak to her directly, explaining in simple, loving terms that her physical body had become too sick to continue living, but that her spirit was eternal and beloved. They were to tell Emma about the beautiful place where children's souls go after death, where they could play and learn and grow without pain or fear. They were to assure her that her family would always love her and remember her, but that she needed to go to this special place where other children and loving spiritual guides were waiting to take care of her. Most importantly, they were to give Emma permission to take the doll with her if she needed it for comfort, but to help her understand that in the spirit realm, she wouldn't need physical objects to feel safe and loved. The Peterson family held this ceremony on a quiet Sunday afternoon, with each family member speaking words of love and release to Emma. During the ceremony, several family members reported feeling a warm, peaceful presence in the room, and Martha later said she felt as though Emma had hugged her one final time before the sense of the child's presence faded away. The phenomena in the house stopped immediately, and Martha found that while she still grieved Emma's death, the obsessive quality of her grief had transformed into something more peaceful and accepting. The family was able to gradually convert Emma's room into a memorial space where they could remember her with joy rather than the desperate clinging that had previously characterized their mourning. The fifth and final category of soul-trapping objects that Edgar Cayce identified was the most complex and potentially dangerous: items connected to unfinished business or unfulfilled obligations. This category emerged from his work with a businessman named Robert Chen from Richmond, Virginia, who had inherited his father's desk along with a business that was failing due to debts his father had accumulated through questionable dealings. Robert's father, William Chen, had spent the last 3 years of his life working frantically at his mahogany desk, trying to find ways to pay back money he had borrowed from various investors through promises he couldn't keep. William had died of a heart attack while sitting at the desk, surrounded by papers and ledgers documenting his failed attempts to resolve his financial obligations. After inheriting both the desk and the business problems, Robert began experiencing phenomena that were more intense and disturbing than any of the previous cases. He would sit at the desk to work on resolving his father's debts, only to find himself becoming obsessively focused on financial schemes and business ideas that seemed to come from outside his own mind. He would work at the desk for hours without realizing how much time had passed, and would wake up the next morning with detailed business plans written in handwriting that looked like his father's. Family members noticed that Robert's personality seemed to change when he worked at the desk. He became aggressive and manipulative in his business dealings, characteristics that had never been part of his nature before. He began making the same types of questionable financial decisions that had led to his father's problems, and several longtime friends expressed concern that Robert was repeating his father's destructive patterns. Edgar Cayce's reading 6492-1 revealed that William Chen's soul was not just trapped by the desk, but was actively trying to complete the unfinished business that had consumed his final years. Unlike the previous cases where trapped souls were primarily seeking comfort or release, William was attempting to use his son's consciousness and body to resolve the financial obligations that he felt responsible for even after death. This situation represented what Cayce called possession through obligation, where a deceased person's sense of duty or responsibility created such a strong attachment to unfinished tasks that their consciousness remained focused on the physical realm rather than accepting the spiritual truth that earthly obligations end with physical death. William's trapped state was causing harm not only to himself but also to Robert, whose own spiritual development was being compromised by his father's influence. The financial schemes that seemed to come through Robert were actually William's continued attempts to solve problems through the same flawed thinking that had created them in the first place. The solution Cayce provided was the most complex of all the cases, requiring Robert to directly confront his father's trapped consciousness and help him understand several important spiritual truths. First, Robert needed to help his father understand that death had released him from all earthly obligations and that continuing to focus on these problems was preventing his spiritual growth. Second, Robert needed to take full responsibility for resolving the inherited business problems through his own choices and efforts, making it clear to his father that this was now Robert's responsibility alone. This would remove William's sense that he needed to remain involved in earthly affairs. Finally, Robert needed to help his father understand that the guilt and shame he felt about his business failures were emotions that belonged to his earthly experience and did not need to be carried into his spiritual existence. Robert performed the release ceremony that Cayce recommended, speaking directly to his father while sitting at the desk. He acknowledged the financial problems his father had left behind and assured him that Robert would handle them with integrity and wisdom. He forgave his father for the difficult situation he had inherited and asked his father to forgive himself for the mistakes he had made during his lifetime. Most importantly, Robert told his father that his worth as a soul was not determined by his business success or failure, and that the spiritual realm offered him opportunities for growth and service that were far more meaningful than any earthly accomplishment. The results of this intervention were profound and immediate. Robert reported feeling as though a heavy presence had lifted from the room, and he no longer experienced the obsessive focus on questionable business schemes when working at the desk. More significantly, Robert found that he was able to approach his inherited business problems with clarity and wisdom, ultimately finding honest solutions that resolved most of the debts without resorting to his father's manipulative tactics. These 5 categories of soul-trapping objects revealed by Edgar Cayce's work represented far more than just supernatural curiosities. They provided crucial insights into the nature of consciousness after death and the ways that intense emotional attachments could interfere with natural spiritual processes. Cayce's readings consistently emphasized that souls became trapped not through random misfortune, but through specific emotional and mental states that created energetic anchors to the physical realm. Understanding these patterns could help both living and deceased individuals navigate the death transition more successfully. The practical implications of these discoveries extended beyond individual cases to offer guidance for anyone dealing with inheritance of meaningful objects from deceased relatives. Cayce recommended that people be aware of the emotional states their loved ones had experienced during their final years, and be prepared to perform release ceremonies if any unusual phenomena occurred around inherited items. He also emphasized the importance of healthy grieving processes that honored deceased loved ones, while avoiding the energetic entanglements that could trap souls. True love, according to Cayce, sometimes required the courage to let go and trust that spiritual bonds transcended physical objects and earthly attachments. Perhaps most significantly, these cases demonstrated that death was not an ending, but a transition that required conscious participation from the departing soul. When emotional attachments prevented this conscious participation, souls could become stuck in liminal states that served no one's highest good. The guidance Edgar Cayce provided for helping trapped souls find release consistently emphasized several key principles. First, direct communication with the trapped consciousness was essential, acknowledging their presence while helping them understand their situation. Second, emotional release through forgiveness, acceptance, and love was necessary to dissolve the energetic bonds keeping souls attached to physical objects. Third, clear guidance about the spiritual realm and the peace available there helped confused souls understand where they needed to direct their attention. Finally, living family members needed to examine their own attachments and grief processes to ensure they weren't inadvertently contributing to a loved one's spiritual entrapment through excessive focus on maintaining connection through physical objects. These principles provided a practical framework for understanding and addressing situations where souls might become trapped after death, offering hope and healing for both the living and the dead. The legacy of Edgar Cayce's work in this area continues to provide guidance for families dealing with unusual phenomena around inherited objects and offers profound insights into the nature of consciousness, death, and the continuation of the soul's journey beyond physical existence. The documentation of these cases in the Edgar Cayce archives represents one of the most comprehensive explorations of soul entrapment ever recorded, providing both spiritual understanding and practical solutions for one of humanity's most enduring mysteries: what happens to consciousness after the body dies, and how the living can help ensure that their departed loved ones find peace in whatever realm awaits them beyond this physical existence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.